Hi everybody, this is Peter Schiff. It is Monday, December 3rd, 2012. The posturing over a deal to avoid the so-called fiscal cliff is intensifying. In fact, the president has now thrown another bargaining chip into the pot involving the debt limit. What the president would want, I suppose if he really had his druthers, would be to completely eliminate the debt ceiling altogether. But what the president is in fact proposing is something that would make it much easier for the debt ceiling to be raised and therefore much less relevant in the future. Right now, Congress has to vote to increase the debt ceiling, which they routinely do, although sometimes there is a lot of grandstanding and posturing around the increase, certainly recently, but it has been increased. What the president wants to do is make it much easier. The president would like to be able to unilaterally raise the debt ceiling by presidential decree. And then Congress, if it wants to override that increase, would be able to do so, but it would require the same type of numbers that is now required to override a presidential veto, which would basically mean that the minority party would have no way to prevent the president from increasing the debt ceiling. Now, in typical Orwellian doublespeak, the president is actually selling this idea to the public as if it's being done out of fiscal responsibility, as if we want to send a message to the world that America will always pay its bills, that you can always count on America to pay its bills, and we're going to prove how serious we are about paying our bills by eliminating or raising the debt ceiling. Now, I don't know about you, but it is impossible to pay your bills by going into debt. See, the word pay implies that you paid off the bill, that you're not in debt anymore, right? You get a bill from Visa and you write them a check and now your balance is back to zero. That's paying your bills. You don't pay your Visa by putting the balance on your MasterCard. That just transfers your bill from one creditor to another. So in other words, by going into debt, America doesn't pay its bills. We avoid paying our bills. The debt ceiling itself, assuming it was not raised, that would force us to pay our bills. It's by raising the debt ceiling that we get off the hook. We can avoid paying our bills because instead of paying our bills, we can borrow more money. And what really makes it ridiculous is we're not even paying our MasterCard with our Visa, right? We're paying our MasterCard with our MasterCard. Because the people who own the bonds, or the institutions that own the bonds, when they mature, the government borrows the money from those exact same individuals or institutions. So in other words, the holders of U.S. Treasuries, when they present those treasuries at maturity to the government to be redeemed, where does the U.S. government get the money to redeem the bonds, the maturing bonds? From the very people who own those bonds. So how long do you think you can have your Visa account if every time they sent you a bill, you tried to put the bill on the very same Visa card that you owned? Obviously, you couldn't continue that way indefinitely. In fact, what the president is really admitting to, although he doesn't come right out and say it, is he's admitting that we can't pay our bills. That's why we have to increase the debt ceiling, so that we can borrow more money, because we can't pay our bills. We don't have the capacity to pay our bills. We certainly don't have the political will to pay our bills. I mean, all we're willing to do is tax the top 1 or 2%. That's not going to come close to paying our bills. In order to pay our bills, we'd have to slash government spending, raise taxes on the middle class, and even then, I don't think it's possible if interest rates go up. And because rising interest rates are going to be crucial. If the U.S. economy is ever going to restructure in a way that will provide real economic growth, we need higher interest rates. The problem is when interest rates go up, there is no way that we can service the existing debt. We would be forced to retire it, but of course that's impossible as well because we don't have the means or the resources to do it, and so we kick the can down the road by getting rid of the debt ceiling. Of course, what this also amounts to is another official acknowledgement that the United States is running the world's largest Ponzi scheme. But what's even more amazing than the fact that we would admit that we're running a Ponzi scheme is that the participants, the people who are being victimized by this scheme, are going to continue to sign up. That foreigners, or anybody for that matter, that is buying U.S. treasuries and loaning money to the U.S. government will keep loaning us money even though we've admitted that we can't pay it back and that we'll never pay it back. You see, borrowing money to pay off maturing obligations is the exact definition of a Ponzi scheme. We need to continue to borrow more money so that we can pretend to pay back the money that we've already borrowed. That is what the president wants to preserve. Under the guise of paying our bills, he wants to make sure that we never have to pay our bills. Of course, that's not the case, because eventually the world's going to wake up. Maybe this will be the signal that shocks them into reality. The president is hoping to send a signal to the world that we're serious about paying our bills, but I don't know that his message will resonate the way he believes, because I don't think that is what our creditors are going to hear. What they're really going to hear is the sky's the limit when it comes to debt, that nothing stands between the U.S. government and more debt. And once they realize that, and they figure out that they're not loaning us money, nobody really loans the U.S. government money, because loaning somebody money implies they can actually pay it back. When they admit they can't pay it back, you're not making a loan, you're making a gift. And I don't think our creditors really view themselves as benefactors. They think we're going to pay them back, despite the fact that we told them that we're not. Now, I know, of course, we can print money to pay them back, and we can do that more easily now that Congress can, that their debt ceiling is no longer an issue, as long as the Fed cooperates, and there's no signs that the Fed will not cooperate. If we left the debt ceiling where it was, we'd actually be forced to deal with our bills. And if we can't pay them, we'd have to admit that. But by eliminating that limit, right, then it gives the Fed the ability to buy more bonds. And of course they're going to have to, because as our creditors realize that there is no limit to our debt, they're not going to want to buy the bonds. They're not going to want to roll those bonds over. And so the Federal Reserve is going to be forced, if it wants to prevent the U.S. government from defaulting, the Fed is going to be forced to monetize that, to buy up all those bonds. And of course, we replace default with inflation. But from the perspective of our creditors, there's really no difference. Not getting your money back and getting your money back that doesn't have any purchasing power or has a lot less purchasing power are basically distinctions without a difference. Some of you might be wondering why it is that we even have a debt ceiling. Where did it come from? After all, it's not in the Constitution. There's nothing in the Constitution that limits the government's ability to take on debt. But the fact of the matter is, the U.S. government didn't have a lot of debt prior to the institution of the debt limit. The debt limit came about in 1917, and let me tell you why it happened. In 1913, Congress, by an act, created the Federal Reserve. Now, prior to the Federal Reserve, the only way the government could repay its debts was by taxing the public. There was no central bank that could monetize those debts, and so we actually had to pay our bills back then. And so there was a natural limit to how much money the government could borrow, because it was limited by the willingness and ability of the taxpayers to make good on those obligations. And so there was a natural check against big debts, because the public didn't want to pay for them. But in 1913, when we created the Federal Reserve, there was the potential of the government being able to issue debt which that central bank could buy. And originally, the way the Congress dealt with that is they made it illegal for the newly created Federal Reserve to own any U.S. Treasury obligations. Therefore, it was impossible for the Federal Reserve in 1913 to monetize any U.S. government debt. And they thought that was necessary because they wanted to make sure that Congress didn't use the newly created central bank as a mechanism to monetize its debts, because it didn't want Congress to have the ability to run up big debts. Prior to the Federal Reserve, it didn't have that ability, and now with the Federal Reserve, because the Fed was denied the ability to buy treasuries, they thought that they had protected the public from runaway debts. The problem was 4 years later, in 1917, the U.S. was in World War I. And Congress needs to borrow a lot of money fast. And the easiest way to do that is to borrow from the Federal Reserve. But they can't because of the Federal Reserve Act, which they amended. But now a lot of people in Congress were fearful about making that amendment because they were going to eliminate the barrier to governments and accumulating big debts. So they had an idea of creating a debt limit, a statutory limit that would prevent the government from borrowing too much money. After all, they were going to be removing the natural limits to government debt, which is capacity and a willingness to repay the debts. They were eliminating that by allowing the Federal Reserve to buy treasuries. So what they did is they created a statutory limit to replace the natural limit that they had just torn down. But what the Congress didn't understand back then is that the ceiling could be raised. And in fact, that ceiling was raised many times. In fact, every time it was approached, it was raised. I think it's been raised more than 70 times since it was originally established back in 1917. And now, of course, we're talking about either eliminating it completely or making it so easy for the president to raise it that for all practical purposes, it's been eliminated. The worst part of it is we're eliminating it under the pretense that we want to pay our bills, under the pretense that we want to be fiscally responsible, when it's the most reckless and irresponsible thing we can do. Or at least, it's kind of honest, because it's more of an admission of how reckless and how irresponsible we are. Because we don't have to have this show every year or two when they have to raise the debt ceiling, where some congressmen actually pretend that they care about the debt. I mean, they care about it only to the extent that they can use it as a campaign issue. The Republicans like to campaign that they voted against increasing the debt ceiling, although, of course, they'll always make sure they have a number of votes to actually pass it, so there's some Republicans that can safely vote against it. Even some Democrats might vote against it, but they'll know that those are simply ceremonial votes, because the overall increase is going to pass because Congress doesn't want to pay its bills. That's the irony. It's increasing the debt ceiling that enables us to avoid paying our bills, not the reverse. Of course, all these same congressmen, every time they run for re-election, they campaign about a balanced budget amendment, how they're in favor of a balanced budget amendment. Find any Republican running for Congress, go to their website. There's not a single one probably that isn't campaigning on a balanced budget amendment. Well, we don't need a balanced budget amendment so long as we have a debt ceiling that people don't raise, because that's the same thing. If you don't raise the debt ceiling, then the budget has to be balanced. If you vote to increase the debt ceiling, then you're voting against the balanced budget. So we don't need a we don't need a constitutional amendment. We have the debt ceiling. Of course, if we get rid of it or make it meaningless because the president can unilaterally raise it, what you're actually doing is repealing something that is acting as if it were a balanced budget amendment. And it shows that it's all political, because the reason that so many people are for a balanced budget amendment is because it doesn't exist and they'll never have to vote for it. Of course, the ultimate of ironies will be that at the moment that the president and Congress takes credit, right, for avoiding the fiscal cliff and acting responsibly by telling the world that we will always pay our bills, by going into debt indefinitely, by borrowing more money without limit, right? That's the way that we're going to pay our bills. But that we supposedly send this message and everything is safe, that's probably when we really have to start to worry. Because, as I said, this could be a moment where our creditors maybe, get shocked into reality to understand the situation that they are in, that we are in, that there is no limit, that we will borrow money until we can't do it anymore, right? That we're not going to do anything about this crisis. We're not going to do anything to defuse this ticking bomb. It's simply going to go off. And I think our creditors are going to want to put as much distance as they can between themselves and the explosion. They're going to want to sell dollars. They're going to want to sell debt denominated in dollars. What is that going to mean? A weaker dollar means higher consumer prices for Americans. It ultimately means higher interest rates for Americans. It means the rug is going to be pulled out of this phony economy. It means we're going to go over the mother of all fiscal cliffs, and one that is impossible to avoid. So my advice is don't wait for that. Get out of your dollars. I've been saying this for a while, but I think the urgency and the time with which to do it is going to be running out. So you get out of your dollars, you get out of any debt denominated in dollars, because we're not going to pay our bills. We're going to inflate them away, which is the same thing as default. So you don't want to ride out that inflation. You want to get out of U.S. currency. You want to look at foreign currencies where the governments are much less irresponsible. Look at real money. Look at gold and silver. Look at foreign stocks, if they're suitable, that pay dividends. Do whatever you can to get out of Dodge, because just when the government assures you that there's nothing to worry about, that's the time where you need to worry the most. Anyway, thanks for listening. Don't forget the Peter Schiff Show, Mondays through Fridays, 10 a.m. to noon Eastern Time. Listen live. If you can't listen live, just go to schiffradio.com anytime during the day, and you can listen to the repeat of the show for free. Bye for now.